I kissed her before I knew how to say kiss in her language. It was impulsive and graceless, a moment born from tension I hadn't even admitted to myself until it cracked open and spilled over in a breath I couldn't contain. Her lips were warm and tasted faintly of something herbal and sour, maybe that cheap wine she liked so much. I remember the way her eyes flicked open in slow motion, the beat of silence that followed, and how she didn't pull away. Instead, she touched my face like I was something fragile and ridiculous and strangely endearing. Then she said my name, clearly, without an accent, and that, somehow, was the most intimate part. We'd met 3 weeks earlier through a language exchange app. I wanted to improve my fluency for work. She said she was trying to write poetry in English but kept losing the rhythm. Her profile had a blurry photo of a cat and the tagline, "I speak with my hands." I assumed it was a metaphor. I learned later it wasn't. From the very beginning, nothing about her was structured or expected. She arrived to our first meeting without a notebook, without a pen, with no agenda, except a bottle of grocery store wine and a half loaf of bread wrapped in a scarf. She said learning worked better when the brain was relaxed, and I, out of politeness and vague amusement, went along with it. The first meeting lasted longer than I expected. She spoke quickly and carelessly, laughed loudly at her own mistakes, and leaned in far too close when she was trying to emphasize something. I was hesitant, self-conscious, a little guarded, especially with someone who radiated that kind of ease. I had come prepared with lists of verbs and grammar rules. She rolled her eyes when I pulled them out and told me would never get anywhere that way. Language is breath, she said, not structure. I didn't argue, but I didn't forget it either. By the second meeting, she brought strawberries and wore an oversized t-shirt that hung off one shoulder like it had been draped there by accident. She lounged on my couch like she had always belonged there, her bare feet tucked under her, flipping through a children's picture book in English and laughing at the expressions. She asked me how to pronounce belly button and made me say it 3 times just because she liked the shape my mouth made. I didn't realize then how much I enjoyed watching her watch me, how there was something in the way she absorbed everything, not just the words, but my movements, my reactions, my hesitations, like she was learning me, not just my language. She never took notes, but she remembered everything. The way I said actually when I was trying to sound smarter than I felt. The slight curl in my lip when I was holding back a correction, how I preferred paper books over e-readers, how I stirred my tea counterclockwise, how I crossed my legs always left over right. She told me none of this. She just mirrored it back, casually, instinctively, and I began to feel exposed in a way I didn't yet have the words to explain. It was the third meeting when she showed up in a silk robe, unbelted, thrown over shorts and a bralette, like she'd forgotten or never cared that our sessions had a line between private and something else. I hesitated when I opened the door. She looked at me for a beat too long, then walked past me without a word, went straight to the couch, and asked what the past participle of to want was. I couldn't answer right away. I was too busy watching how the robe slipped off her shoulder as she stretched. She smirked like she knew. Maybe she did. That day, we didn't open any books. She said we were going to practice conversational speech. But instead of practicing, we talked. Not in structured sentences or assigned roles, just wandered. About childhood, music, strangers on the train, the softness of towels after rain. She told me that in her language, some verbs change based on desire, not time. That you can imply longing just by altering a suffix. I told her that sounded dangerous. She grinned and replied that all the best languages were. She had a habit of leaning in when I spoke, like she wanted to taste my words before answering. I felt myself leaning too. Little by little, the air between us thickened. There was a pause, a long one, When our knees touched for the first time, she didn't pull back. Neither did I. That night, I didn't sleep. My brain replayed every glance, every brush of skin, every offhand compliment. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew something was. It felt like standing at the edge of a page before the first word is written. The kiss happened at the fourth meeting. No wine this time, no strawberries. Just her, barefoot and unreadable, sitting on the kitchen counter while I made tea. We were talking about idioms. I said something about getting under someone's skin, and she asked what that really meant. I told her it was about obsession, about someone becoming too close, too present, too much. She tilted her head and asked softly if that meant I had a definition for what we were doing. That's when it happened. I turned to answer, and she was closer than I thought. My words caught. I saw the way her eyes tracked my mouth, the way her breath shifted when I leaned forward. I didn't think. I didn't ask. I just kissed her, and in that moment, the room changed shape. There was no dramatic gasp, no fireworks, just her lips opening beneath mine, warm and slow and deliberate. Her fingers found my wrist, light but certain, anchoring me in place. I felt a jolt of something, fear maybe, or recognition, like I'd just spoken a sentence I hadn't meant to say aloud. But it was too late. The meaning was already out there. She pulled back just enough to look at me. I couldn't read her face. My heart pounded. I waited for her to laugh or tease or leave. But instead, she reached up and touched my cheek with her thumb, tracing the curve under my eye, and then, in perfect English, she said my name like it was a sentence all on its own. That night, I sat alone in my bedroom, fingers still tingling, lips still swollen. I stared at the wall and tried to replay the moment, to categorize it, translate it, file it away like a phrase I didn't quite understand. But no matter how I turned it over in my mind, I came back to the same truth. I had kissed my language partner, and I hadn't done it to practice conjugation. I had done it because I wanted to know what she tasted like in every tense. She didn't mention the kiss, not once. Not the next time we met, not when she dropped her tote bag by the door like nothing had happened, not when she asked if I had learned any new vocabulary. I had, of course. Words like response, impulse, regret, longing. But I couldn't say any of them without hearing the memory of her breath brushing against mine. So I lied and said no. She took her usual seat on the couch, legs tucked beneath her, wearing an old college hoodie that swallowed her frame and exposed a sliver of her bare thigh. I sat across from her on the floor, notebook open but untouched, my pen resting idle in the margin. She began reading aloud from a short story I had chosen, something about an unfamiliar city and a woman who couldn't stop walking. Her voice filled the room gently, like steam curling from a mug. It wrapped around me, softened the angles of my tension, and blurred the edges of the space between us. I watched her lips move. I counted the seconds her fingers lingered on the paper before turning the page. When she caught me looking, she smiled absently, as if we were just two people working on fluency and not quietly dissecting a moment neither of us had named. The air between us wasn't awkward. It was soft, dense, like the pause between inhale and exhale when nothing moves but everything is about to. She leaned forward to ask me about verb endings. I didn't hear the question. I was too aware of the way her collar slipped sideways as she reached for her mug. I nodded anyway. She didn't press. That night marked the beginning of a rhythm. We returned to our lessons, but the energy had shifted. Every session was laced with something unspoken, something barely there, like a foreign word you think you understand, but hesitate to use out loud. She would brush past me to reach for a book and let her fingers trail against my arm. I would hand her a page and notice how our skin met, knuckle to knuckle, just long enough to make my pulse stutter. We spoke more slowly than before, chose our words with care. She explained to me that her native language had a soft case, one used to express gentle movement, tenderness, things that didn't quite belong anywhere else. I asked her how to recognize it in a sentence. She tilted her head, looked at me with something too deep to be amusement, and said, "You had to feel it." That grammar couldn't always explain what bodies already knew. The days grew colder. She started bringing scarves and throwing them over the backs of chairs like shedding skins. One evening, I offered her tea, and our hands touched at the kettle. Just that, skin against skin. But it was a contact that held. Neither of us spoke. The kettle whined quietly. She smiled but didn't move away. I felt the heat of her fingers long after she let go. We sat closer on the couch now. Sometimes her knee would press against mine, and I'd pretend it was accidental. But there were too many accidents, too much nearness. I began to memorize her habits like conjugation rules, the way she tapped her thumb twice before flipping a page, the way her breath caught when reading aloud in English just before unfamiliar sounds, the shape of her lips when she mouthed translations under her breath. One night she stretched, arms overhead, and the hem of her sweater lifted. I saw a sliver of her stomach, smooth and pale, with the faintest inked curve of a tattoo near her hip bone. I didn't ask what it meant. I just stared too long and tried not to imagine what it would feel like beneath my palm. That was becoming a problem. My imagination. It grew louder with each hour we spent pretending nothing happened. It whispered stories onto her skin, turned our shared silence into a language of its own. I started dressing differently, subtly at first. A tighter top, jeans that fit closer at the waist. I told myself it was because I wanted to feel confident, but I caught myself watching her reaction too often to believe it. Sometimes she noticed. Her gaze would drop to my shoulder, linger a heartbeat too long, then flick back up like nothing had happened. Sometimes she didn't notice at all. Those days felt colder than the others. She corrected my pronunciation less. Instead, she asked more questions, personal ones, under the guise of vocabulary drills. How do you say regret? What's the difference between missing and yearning? Is there a word in English for the ache of wanting someone you can't touch? I told her we call that feeling a metaphor. She laughed, then she wrote it down. The physical closeness became second nature. At the end of one session, she reached for a throw blanket on the couch and accidentally knocked it onto both of us. We stayed like that, shared under fabric, pressed shoulder to shoulder, reading from the same book. My eyes didn't follow the words. They followed her fingers as they moved across the page. I didn't speak. I didn't dare break the moment with sound. Another night, it rained. She showed up barefoot, hair damp from the walkover, and asked if she could change. I handed her a sweatshirt from my drawer and left her alone in the bathroom. When she emerged, sleeves rolled to her elbows, bare legs beneath fabric that had only ever belonged to me, something inside me folded in on itself. I didn't want to name it. I was still pretending, still hiding behind my syntax, hoping she wouldn't read between the lines I was too afraid to write. But it was becoming harder. Her scent clung to the hoodie after she left. Her hair stuck to my pillows. She left behind a single earring once, nestled between the couch cushions, like punctuation in a story I didn't know how to end. I caught myself one morning replaying the kiss, not the act itself, but the exact moment before. The flicker of tension, the shift in breath, the angle of her head. It had become an imprint, a verb conjugated only in memory, and I kept wondering if she thought about it too. The soft case, she had said, is used when something doesn't quite fit, when it slips between categories, neither subject nor object, neither here nor gone. That's what we had become. A sentence that refused to settle. A phrase written on the edge of silence, waiting to be spoken, or broken, or both. It started with a shift so subtle I almost convinced myself I imagined it. Her messages came later in the day. The tone, still playful, still curious, had a new kind of pause hidden between the words. She was still there, still present, but not quite in the same way. I told myself not to overanalyze it. I told myself not to assign meaning where there might be none. But fear doesn't ask for permission. It settles in like an adverb, quiet, modifying everything without needing its own spotlight. I skipped our next session. No explanation. I said I had a meeting, which wasn't a lie, just not the reason. The real reason was that I had started dreaming of her again, more vividly, more dangerously. In one of the dreams, she pressed her lips against my neck and whispered something in her native language. I didn't understand it, but I woke up gasping. I couldn't face her the next day without feeling that dream like a bruise under my skin. The day after that, I skipped again. When she finally texted, she didn't ask where I'd been. She simply sent a voice memo of her reading a poem. I played it over and over, not for the words, but for the sound of her voice, the soft cadence, the way she sighed slightly before each line break. I wanted to respond. I typed and deleted a dozen times. Eventually, I sent back a thumbs-up emoji. It felt like a betrayal, but I couldn't make myself say more. I started avoiding the cafe we always met at, changed my route home, muted her notifications. Not because I didn't want to see her, but because I wanted to see her too much. Because every time I thought about her mouth, my own body answered in a language I didn't fully speak. I was afraid of how fluent I was becoming. I tried to distract myself with routines, work, groceries, books I couldn't focus on. I filled the silence with anything that didn't sound like her. But she was everywhere. Her scarf was still draped over the chair in my hallway. Her handwriting still marked the corner of a notebook I couldn't throw away. Her perfume lingered faintly on a pillow she'd leaned against. I carried her like a second skin, too close to peel away without bleeding. One evening, I opened our chat history and scrolled back to the beginning. The early conversations were clumsy, lighthearted, full of misplaced accents and laughter. Back then, we were just language partners, strangers trying to understand each other through broken grammar. I tried to find the exact moment it changed, but there wasn't one, just a slow slope downward into something messier, deeper, quieter. I realized then that fear isn't a flash, it's erosion. You don't notice it until something suddenly collapses. She finally stopped texting. Days passed, then a week. The silence became its own presence. I kept expecting her to show up anyway, in the middle of a rainy afternoon, asking if I still remembered how to conjugate the future tense. But she didn't, and I didn't reach out. I told myself it was better this way, cleaner, simpler. I convinced myself that what we had wasn't real, that it was just proximity and novelty and wine-fueled confusion. I repeated this so often, I started to believe it. And then I received a postcard. It was small, bent at the corners, addressed in her uneven script. The front showed a map of a city I didn't recognize. On the back, a single sentence written in her language. No signature, no translation, just a date. I stared at it for hours. I tried plugging it into a translator, but the words didn't make sense. They came out mangled, uncertain. I stared until the letters blurred. I slept with it on my nightstand, half expecting it to change meaning in the night. The fear returned in a new form, regret. A heavy, creeping feeling that crawled along my spine each morning and settled behind my ribs by sunset. I played out every scenario. If I had kissed her again, if I had asked her to stay, if I had told her the truth, that I hadn't stopped thinking about her for a single day. But all I had were hypotheticals, floating like useless particles in the air, the kind of language you can't use in any real sentence. The next time I saw her name on my screen, it was by accident. A shared friend posted a photo. She was in the background, laughing, holding someone else's hand. I stared at the image, zoomed in until it pixelated, studying the angle of her smile. She looked happy. She looked distant. She looked like she belonged to another narrative, one I had wandered out of without realizing the chapter had ended. That night, I sat in the kitchen and whispered her name, just once, just to feel it on my tongue. It tasted unfamiliar, foreign, like a word you recognize but can't quite place. I poured myself a glass of wine and opened our old textbook. I turned to the section on adverbs. There it was, modifiers of emotion, position, time, words that shape how something happens. I wrote one in the margin, fearfully, then underlined it. That was how I had kissed her, how I had pulled away, how I had loved her, without ever admitting that's what it was. Not bravely, not fully, just fearfully. And sometimes that's all it takes to change the ending of a story you never meant to stop telling. I showed up without warning. There was no message, no call ahead, just the sudden ache of impulse and the weight of all the words I had left unsaid. I stood at her door, unsure of what I wanted. Clarity, closure, maybe just one more look at the face I had been erasing in fragments for weeks. I knocked before I could change my mind. When she opened it, barefoot and wrapped in a robe I didn't recognize, I almost lost the nerve to speak. She didn't ask why I was there. She stepped aside, left the door open, and walked away like she had been expecting me all along. I followed, slowly, through the familiar hallway that now felt slightly foreign, rearranged in subtle ways I couldn't name. The books had moved. The scent in the air was different. She had replaced the blue curtains with gauzy white ones that trembled in the breeze. Even the light looked different. Or maybe I did. She sat on the floor beside the low table, legs folded underneath her, cradling a ceramic mug in both hands like it was an anchor. I sat across from her, hands in my lap, trying not to look like a stranger in a place that had once felt like a second home. The silence stretched between us, soft and dense. It wasn't angry, it wasn't awkward, it was loaded. We both knew there were things to say, but neither of us wanted to go first. I stared at her cup, watched the steam rise and fade. She watched me watch it. Finally, she reached for a book, a thin, familiar one from our earliest sessions. She slid it across the table without a word. My fingers hesitated before touching the cover. It was the one we used to practice basic sentence structure. I had hated its simplicity back then. It felt too slow, too elementary. Now, it felt like the only place to begin. She opened it to the section on declarative sentences. I looked at the page, then at her. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes were steady. It felt like she was asking a question without speaking. I nodded slowly and picked up the pencil lying nearby. Subject, verb, object. The foundation of understanding. She tapped the subject line with her finger, and I wrote, I. She tapped the verb line, and I hesitated, then wrote, want. She looked at me, waited, then touched the object space. My hand shook slightly as I wrote the word, her. It looked ridiculous in its simplicity. 3 words that felt like a full confession. I stared at the sentence like it might vanish if I blinked too long. She didn't respond. Instead, she flipped to the next page, questions. She tapped the sentence stem. My turn. I wrote slowly, do you want me? Her eyes didn't leave the page. She tapped once, then turned it again. Imperatives. She picked up the pencil and wrote her own sentence in neat, deliberate print. Come here. My breath caught. The pencil rested between her fingers like it belonged there. I didn't move right away. I just looked at the words. They felt larger than the page, larger than the room. When I finally stood and stepped around the table, the distance between us dissolved into something breathless. She rose with me, slow and silent. Her hand reached out, touched my arm, then slid down until our fingers interlaced. Her body was warm, familiar, terrifying. She brought my hand to her waist, and I felt the curve of her hip beneath the soft fabric of her robe. She leaned forward, her forehead brushing mine. No words, just the weight of shared air and the memory of all we hadn't said. Her lips met mine with no preamble. There was no hesitation this time, no fear, only clarity. Her mouth moved against mine with a kind of quiet hunger, patient and searching. I answered with everything I had kept buried. My hands cupped her face, then slid into her hair. Her robe fell open slightly, revealing the delicate line of her collarbone. I kissed her there too, slowly, reverently, like a sentence too sacred to rush. She pulled me toward the bedroom, walking backward with her fingers hooked in mine. I followed blindly. The room was dim, lit only by the gray spill of twilight through the curtains. She sat on the edge of the bed, pulled me between her knees, and undid the tie of her robe. It slipped off her shoulders, pooling behind her like punctuation. She wore nothing underneath. I let my fingers trace the dip between her breasts, the smooth plane of her stomach, the arc of her thighs. Her body was language in motion, fluent and fluid, every inch of her a phrase I had longed to understand. She tugged at my shirt, lifted it over my head, and kissed the place just beneath my ribs. I shivered, overwhelmed by sensation, by the intimacy of being seen like this. She pulled me down onto the bed, onto her, around her, our legs tangled, skin against skin. The sheets rustled like pages. Her hands moved over me slowly, deliberately, guiding, inviting, not demanding. I felt like I was being translated, finally and completely. She whispered something in her language, the words low and close to my ear. I didn't understand it, but I didn't need to. I felt it in her breath, her touch, the way her body pressed into mine. I responded with movement, with rhythm, with everything words could never capture. I arched beneath her, gasped against her neck, held her tighter each time she brought me closer to the edge. When I came, it felt like punctuation, a long-held sentence finally released, a confession underlined with breath. Afterward, we lay still, bodies curved into each other, the warmth of her thigh resting against mine. I traced circles along her spine with my fingertips, the quiet beat of her heart echoing beneath my palm. The book still sat open on the table in the next room, our sentences resting inside. That night, I understood something I hadn't before. Structure isn't about limits, it's about meaning. It gives shape to chaos. It allows us to say what we're too afraid to name. And sometimes it's the only way to be brave. I wanted her. She wanted me. Everything else was just grammar. In the days that followed, there were no rules, no sessions scheduled, no exercises planned. The structure we had relied on dissolved into something unspoken, fluid, and uncontained. She came and went like a tide, sometimes staying long enough to fall asleep with her arm across my stomach, other times leaving before sunrise, her absence a wordless echo across my bedsheets. I never asked where she went, I never asked who else might be touching the same curve of her hip I had memorized with my lips. The questions hovered like mist, but I swallowed them down like they had no meaning. She didn't say she loved me. I didn't say I loved her. It wasn't because I didn't feel it. It was because I didn't know how to phrase it in a way that would survive the moment. What we had didn't fit into the tidy clauses of romance or the familiar stutter of confession. It was physical, emotional, silent. It was spoken in glances and unfinished gestures. She would pass behind me and let her hand drift across my lower back like a breath. I would reach for her wrist in bed just to feel her pulse beneath my fingers. When we did speak, the words were small, incidental, entirely beside the point. The silence between us grew rich and strange. There were nights when we didn't touch at all, just lay back to back, our spines mirroring each other, breathing in opposite rhythms. Other nights, she would crawl over me without a word, mouth open against my skin, not asking permission because she already had it. She would press her face into my shoulder as she moved inside the space between my legs, and I would bite my lip to keep from crying out her name like a sentence I didn't know how to finish. I stopped correcting her grammar. She stopped bringing books. We replaced vocabulary with instinct, syntax with fingertips. Our language became a series of incomplete phrases, moans, sighs, gasps, the sharp intake of breath when her teeth grazed the soft place under my jaw. I learned that she liked to be kissed hard when she was overwhelmed, that she laughed softly when I ran my nails down the inside of her thigh, that she could come without sound, holding her breath like a secret. I started wearing her clothes around my apartment, oversized sweatshirts, loose tank tops, soft cotton briefs that smelled like her. I would catch myself walking past a mirror and see her in my own reflection. Not her face, not her body, but the way she moved through me. I began cooking meals I had never tried before because she once said the name sounded beautiful. I added her music to my playlists and started singing the words without knowing what they meant. Her language invaded mine in quiet ways, untranslatable, but present. She left small things behind. A book she'd underlined in 5 different colors. A half-burned candle with a scent I couldn't name. A broken hair tie. A sock with no match. Each item felt like a clue or a breadcrumb or a trap. I arranged them on my nightstand like offerings, unsure whether I was being worshipped or warned. One night, she didn't come. No message, no reason. I waited until the candles burned down, until my phone battery died, until even the silence started to feel embarrassed. I fell asleep in the clothes I had worn all day, curled around a pillow I had once pressed between us to muffle the sound of her moaning. In my dream, she stood at the edge of a cliff and said something in her language. I asked her to repeat it. She smiled and jumped. I woke up shaking, sweating. I reached for my phone. Still no message. I got up, opened the window, let the cold air bite at my skin. I thought about all the words I didn't know how to say, not just in her language, but in mine. I didn't know how to say, please stay. I didn't know how to say, I'm afraid I'm not enough. I didn't know how to say, I want you only, even if I know you don't belong to me. All I could do was wait. She came back the next evening. She didn't explain. I didn't ask. She undressed slowly, like shedding armor, climbed into bed beside me, pressed her forehead to mine, and closed her eyes. I counted her eyelashes in the dark. I felt her breath on my lips, but didn't move to kiss her. We existed like that, frozen in place, suspended in something too fragile to name. I never knew what she was thinking. She held her feelings like a tight sentence, perfectly constructed and impossible to diagram. But I knew the way her body told me she was present. The way she curled into me after, wrapping her legs around mine like a sentence refusing to end. The way she kissed my temple before leaving, not as a promise, but as punctuation. We lived between commas, between touches, between departures. Every time I thought I could define us, the meaning slipped. She was not a chapter in a love story. She was an untranslated word scrawled in the margins of everything I thought I knew about desire. I didn't want to decode her. I just wanted to stay inside the sentence, even if it ended without warning, even if it never made sense to anyone but me. The last time I saw her, she was standing at the window with her back to me, wrapped in one of my old sweaters, the sleeves too long, the collar stretched wide. Her hair was slightly damp, like she'd just stepped out of the shower but hadn't dried off completely. The morning light filtered through the blinds in pale stripes across her shoulder blades. She looked still, almost unreal, like a photograph I had once taken and lost. She didn't turn around when I said her name. I hadn't said it in days, not because I didn't want to, but because I had started to fear how it would sound. Like something slipping past the edge of use, like a verb nobody conjugated anymore. Irregular, unstable, fading. That morning, everything felt final without anyone declaring it. Her mug on the table, untouched. Her shoes by the door, angled slightly out, as if they'd been kicked off by someone who wasn't planning to stay long. I noticed the way the sheet was folded on the couch. Her favorite blanket no longer draped casually over the back, but folded, squared, centered. Intentional. Too neat to be innocent. I sat at the table and waited. I thought maybe she would say something, a small thing, anything. But the silence stretched, and I felt myself sinking into it like quicksand. I watched the shape of her body in the light and tried to remember every place my hands had touched. I tried to map her skin with memory, her neck, her thighs, the sharp bone of her ankle, the pulse at the base of her throat. I tried to remember the way she moaned when I kissed her just beneath her rib cage, the way she whispered words in her language when she was too full to speak mine. Eventually she turned. Her expression wasn't cold, just emptied. Like a page after the last word has been written, when all that's left is the white space. She came to me, pressed a kiss to my forehead, and said nothing. I didn't stop her when she gathered her things. I didn't ask where she was going or if she'd be back. I just watched her move through my space like she didn't belong to it anymore. After the door closed, I sat for hours. The house held her absence like a breath no one dared to release. I walked through the rooms as if they might answer me, but everything was still. The pillows didn't remember the weight of her head. The sheets didn't smell like her anymore. Only the walls felt alive, as if they still echoed her laughter somewhere deep inside their paint. I opened my notebook and flipped through the old pages. Her handwriting was still there in the margins, notes she'd made during our early sessions, tiny jokes, phonetic breakdowns. At the top of one page, in her careful, looping script, she had written, "Every verb carries time in its spine." I didn't understand it when she wrote it. Now I did. I started writing out conjugations, not to study, not to learn, just to occupy my hands. I listed verbs in all their forms, to want, to leave, to forget. I stopped at the verb to love. My pen hovered. I didn't know which tense to use. Present felt dishonest. Past felt too complete. Future felt like a lie. So I left it blank. That night, I dreamed of her voice. Not her body, not her mouth, just her voice, saying my name in a way no one else ever had. She spoke a sentence I didn't understand, and in the dream, I begged her to repeat it. But she just smiled, touched her finger to my lips, and said, "Some things don't translate." I woke up with my pillow damp and the taste of her still in my mouth like smoke after a fire. I lay there, unmoving, listening to the sound of the clock ticking on the wall, trying to make peace with the stillness. Days passed, then weeks. I didn't hear from her. I didn't expect to. I told myself she had closed the book, that I had been a chapter, a footnote, maybe even just a phrase, but still, I kept her things where they were. I didn't move the folded blanket. I didn't delete her name from my phone. I let the objects keep meaning, even if the meaning no longer belonged to me. I started speaking aloud again, practicing the language she had taught me. I spoke to the empty room, pronouncing every vowel like it mattered, like she might be listening from some other room, some other place. I told myself this wasn't grief, it was grammar, and I just hadn't learned the structure for endings yet. I went back to the beginning, the first sentence we'd ever constructed together. I am learning. It still applied, but now I would add another. I have lost, and maybe one more. She was. That's the hardest part of all, the shift from present to past. The moment you realize you're conjugating someone in memory instead of in touch, that the body you once knew is now only syntax, that what you shared no longer lives in the present continuous, but has settled into the finality of perfect aspect. To have loved, to have touched, to have let go. Some verbs don't need an object. Some endings don't ask for translation. They just land, quietly, fully, irrevocably, like the last word of a language you were never meant to master.